Welcome back to the deep dive. We are here to take that stack of dense research you shared with us and really distill it down to the most important, maybe surprising nuggets of knowledge.
Yeah.
Today, we're tackling something that feels, well, fundamentally human, yet it's just frustratingly resistant to a single definition: intuition. You know, that immediate, unexplained knowing that we often feel deep down.
Oh, absolutely. It's like the ultimate cross-disciplinary concept, isn't it? I mean, we talk about responding to a gut feeling or trusting your gut in, well, everything, dating, finance, you name it.
Right.
But what is that gut actually doing? We found definitions, all over the map, from pure direct access to unconscious knowledge all the way down to, frankly, a pretty mundane form of unconscious cognition, just, fast pattern matching.
And the history is fascinating, too, baked right into the word itself, the origin of intuition. It takes us back to the Latin verb intuere, which basically means to look inside or to consider. Or you've got the Middle English intuit, meaning to contemplate. So it suggests this, like internal searching, right? A rapid consideration of some deep internal data.
And that historical ambiguity, that's really the key challenge for our deep dive today, I think. Our mission, for you listening, is to navigate these wildly different interpretations. Is intuition some kind of shortcut developed by evolution?
Or is it dangerous? A cognitive error?
Exactly. Or is it, as some of the ancients believed, a genuine pathway to ultimate truth? We really have to unpack how different fields, psychology, philosophy, even business, define this ability. And you have to recognize up front, these interpretations often clash. They really do.
That clashing nature is precisely why we need this analysis, I think. But before we jump right in, there's one crucial, maybe humbling caveat we need to get on the table first.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's important no matter how you define it, whether you think it's psychic or psychological or physiological intuitive knowledge. It tends to be approximate. It's generally a shortcut.
A heuristic, right?
That's the term, yeah, a heuristic. It's fantastically efficient, don't get me wrong, but because it is a shortcut, it's really designed for speed, not perfect precision.
Okay.
And that tension, that trade-off between speed and accuracy, that really underlies almost all the debates we're about to get into.
Okay, let's start in the modern world then, with psychology. Probably the most influential framework for thinking about intuition today comes from Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate. And his dual system view of the mind, he essentially cataloged all our cognitive shortcuts, our biases.
Right. Kahneman's work really gave intuition a precise address, so to speak, in the brain. He talks about two systems for decision-making, for judgment. System one, that's the fast track.
The automatic one.
Exactly. Automatic, instantaneous, unconscious. That's intuition. It's what lets you, say, finish the sentence of the person you're talking to, or swerve around a pothole without consciously thinking, I should swerve now.
And system two is the opposite.
System two is the slow track. It's the intentional, deliberate, effortful thought process, calculating a complex math problem or, God forbid, filling out your tax forms. That's system two work.
Right.
But the insight that really made Kahneman famous wasn't just identifying system one. It was showing its inherent pitfalls. He argues, pretty convincingly, that people constantly overestimate system one.
How so?
Well, we experience that instant, confident feeling, that gut feeling, and we mistake that feeling of confidence for actual knowledge we genuinely possess.
Okay. So the feeling of certainty comes from system one, the intuition.
Yeah.
But the actual knowledge base needed to back it up might be thin or even, non-existent.
Seriously. And this is where cognitive illusions creep in. We trust our immediate gut feeling, say, on whether an investment's going to pan out or if a political prediction is right. And that trust can lead us way off track. Because the fast system, system one, it's prone to specific predictable errors, things like anchoring bias, confirmation bias.
All the stuff he wrote about.
All the stuff he wrote about. So Kahneman's work essentially frames intuition as, yes, a source of spectacular efficiency, but one that really needs constant vetting by the slow, effortful system two.
That makes intuition sound like a highly unreliable, though maybe necessary, internal intern. Fast but error-prone.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
But there's a really powerful counterpoint to this view, isn't there? From another big name in psychology, Gerd Gigerenzer.
Gigerenzer, yes.
Yeah.
He's fascinating because he really champions the beauty of the shortcut. He agrees intuition involves processes that are, devoid of typical step-by-step logic, but he views it much more positively. He often argues that in the real world, with all its messiness, intuition can actually outperform conscious analysis.
Outperform. How does he justify that? That sounds counterintuitive.
It really does. For Gigerenzer, intuition relies on two main things. These basic rules of thumb, again, the heuristics and what he calls the evolved capacities of the brain. But what's really critical is his concept of the less is more effect.
Less is more. In decision-making, that seems to go completely against the grain, the idea that more data always leads to better decisions.
It absolutely does. Gigerenzer suggests that having too much information can actually paralyze you or even corrupt your ability to make the most effective decision, especially in situations with high uncertainty where you don't know the probabilities rather than just risk.
Okay.
In those situations, a simple heuristic, one that deliberately ignores vast amounts of data, can be more effective.
Can you give us, like, a concrete example of that?
Yeah.
How ignoring data helps.
Sure. Think about a really simple heuristic like take the best. Let's say you need to make a fast decision. Which of two cities you don't know much about has a larger population?
Okay.
You just rely on the first piece of information you can recall that distinguishes them. If you know one city has a Major League Baseball team, and you don't know if the other one does, you stop your search right there. You pick the one you recognize, having the team.
Even if there might be, like, a dozen other facts, maybe economic indicators or something, that contradict that simple rule.
Yes. That's the counterintuitive twist Gigerenzer found. In conditions where you have limited experience or information, those simple rules of thumb, those sort of evolved intuitions, they can actively defy the known logical information and still yield a better result than someone who spends hours trying to calculate every single variable.
Wow.
He's essentially saying intuition isn't just a source of error. It's a toolkit that's highly optimized for speed and success in noisy, uncertain, real-world environments.
Okay, so this debate, Kahneman pointing out the flaws, Gigerenzer highlighting the efficiency it naturally leads us to think about intuition and expertise, especially when the stakes are really high, like life or death pressure.
Yeah, and that brings us neatly to the recognition prime decision model, or RPD model. It was developed by Gary Klein. Klein studied people who have to be right and right quickly. Think combat commanders, critical care nurses, and especially firefighters.
Right.
The RPD model explains how these experts make incredibly fast decisions under immense pressure, high stakes, or constantly changing parameters.
Yeah, when you picture a firefighter rushing into a burning building, they aren't standing there making a list of pros and cons, are they? They're just reacting instantly.
Exactly. But Klein's RPD model shows this isn't just some random guess. It's actually a structured blend of System 1 and System 2 operating in milliseconds.
A blend? How does that work so fast?
Well, the process starts with intuition acting as the pattern matching mechanism. The expert scans the situation, the sights, sounds, smells, and rapidly compares it to thousands, literally thousands, of stored experiences in their memory bank. This pattern match quickly suggests a feasible course of action.
So the firefighter sees a particular color of smoke, maybe hears a specific crackling sound, and their experience instantly screams, this looks like that basement fire from '09, the structure's about to collapse.
Yes, exactly that. That identification and the corresponding immediate reaction, get out now. That's the intuitive part. System 1. But the model doesn't stop there. There's a crucial second stage, mental simulation.
Okay, so that's the analysis bit. The conscious review, but super fast.
Precisely. System 2 kicks in, but extremely quickly. In this second stage, the expert consciously runs a quick mental simulation of the action their intuition just suggested. They check that pattern match against the current reality. Okay, intuition says go left, but if I go left, will that floor hold?
Right.
If the mental simulation flags a problem, they discard that plan instantly. Then they run a new pattern match, generate a new intuitive option, and simulate that one, all in fractions of a second.
That's fascinating. It completely reframes the whole gut feeling thing. It's not just the end of the decision process. It's like a high-speed launch pad for the analysis. It's the initial best guess that the expert then immediately stress tests.
Absolutely. And it completely elevates the discussion around reliability. It highlights how we often confuse raw instinct. You know, the automatic fight or flight response, which is hardwired with intuition, which is actually a learned cognitive ability.
Learned. So intuition gets better with practice.
Deeply dependent on practice, on past knowledge and occurrences within a specific domain. The expert's RPD only works because they've built up this massive internal database of patterns through years of experience.
Which means if I, as a total non-firefighter, walk into that same burning building, my gut feeling is likely worse than useless Because I have no relevant patterns to match against?
Pretty much, yeah. Your intuition would be running on empty, essentially. Experience increases the data pool for pattern matching, which boosts the speed and the likelihood of the pattern match being correct. But importantly, it doesn't guarantee infallibility. Even experts get it wrong sometimes. This was actually demonstrated quite beautifully by some early quantitative research.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, there were these Yale studies back in the 1970s. They were looking at nonverbal communication and decision-making.
Yeah, okay.
They tracked subjects who self-identified as highly intuitive. And these intuitive subjects, they made very quick decisions based on really subtle nonverbal cues, like a fleeting facial expression, a shift in posture.
And they couldn't explain why.
Exactly. When asked, they couldn't articulate why they made the decision they made. The rationale was nonverbal, purely intuitive. They just knew.
They just knew. So were they more accurate?
That's the kicker. They just knew. But here's the critical finding. Their overall level of accuracy, at least in that specific controlled lab environment, did not significantly differ from the accuracy of the non-intuitive subjects, the ones who were forced to logically list the cues they observed.
Huh. So the intuitive folks got there faster, but not necessarily better.
In that context, yes. Faster, but not inherently more accurate.
Which brings us right back to Kahneman, doesn't it? If intuition is fast, but not inherently more accurate, why do we rely on it so heavily? Why does it feel so right?
Well, partly because it acts as the ultimate launchpad, as you said earlier. Because it's automatic and comes with that feeling of confidence, intuition often precedes more thoughtful logic.
Right.
So people often use that instantaneous feeling, that gut judgment, and then they engage system 2, the logical thinking, to build a justification or a defense for the feeling they already had.
So the logic comes after the intuitive leap, to rationalize it.
Often, yes. Intuition gives us the starting point, whether it's a moral judgment, a business strategy, a diagnosis, and then our conscious thought rushes in to back up the decision that was actually made in a flash.
Okay, that's a fascinating look at modern psychology's sort of data-driven approach. Now, let's rewind a bit, travel back to the early 20th century. Psychology was just emerging, and the giants of the field weren't arguing over heuristics and System 1 so much as, well, the fundamental nature of the human soul.
Right.
And we have these two absolute titans who had completely opposing views on intuition. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung.
Oh, yeah, it's the ultimate split, isn't it? The analytic versus the holistic. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, he was deeply, deeply committed to observation, to rigorous intellectual manipulation of evidence. His entire framework, the id, ego, superego, it was all based on the idea that unconscious stuff must be brought into conscious awareness through careful analytic work.
So for Freud, if you couldn't observe it, measure its derivation somehow, or analyze it consciously, it just had no value.
Pretty much zero epistemological value, yeah. Freud rejected intuition outright as a valid means of acquiring knowledge. For him, trusting a gut feeling was just relying on some unanalyzed, unverified, probably infantile wish or association bubbling up. The only path to real knowledge for Freud was through the hard analytic work of the intellect. Full stop.
But then his contemporary, and for a while his protege, Carl Jung, took the complete opposite path. Jung didn't just accept intuition, he, elevated it, made it one of the 4 core functions of the human psyche.
He absolutely did. In his really pivotal 1916 work, Psychological Types, Jung classified intuition right alongside sensation, thinking, and feeling. But he called it an irrational function.
Okay, we need to pause on that word, irrational, because in modern usage that sounds negative, like a criticism, you're being irrational.
Right, it does sound that way now. But for Jung, irrational simply meant non-rational. It just meant it functions outside sort of judgmental poles of thinking which judges true or false and feeling which judges pleasant or unpleasant.
Ah, okay.
For Jung, intuition and sensation were the 2 perceiving functions. Sensation tells you what is the facts right there in front of you. Intuition, on the other hand, tells you what could be, the potential, the possibility, the implication.
So how did Jung define that leap? From the sensory data, the what is, to the what could be.
He defined it quite poetically, actually, as perception via the unconscious. He uses sense perception, the raw data, as a starting point, sure. But the goal is to bring forth ideas, images, possibilities from the unconscious mind. It often shows a path forward when the conscious, logical mind is completely blocked or stumped. It's about leaping from the data to the latent potential hidden within it.
And he didn't just define it as a function. He built entire personality types around the dominance of intuition, right? This is where we start seeing the seeds of things like the Myers-Briggs type indicator that many people are familiar with today.
Absolutely. The intuitive type, in Jung's framework, acts not primarily on rational judgment, but on the sheer intensity of that unconscious perception.
Mm.
And the key difference then becomes whether that intuitive energy is directed outward, towards the world that's extroverted intuition, or inward, towards the inner world, introverted intuition.
Okay, let's take the extroverted intuitive type first. These sound like, well, like the people who really drive change in the world.
They're the ultimate pioneers, the trailblazers. They orient themselves almost entirely toward new, promising, but often completely unproven possibilities out there in the external world. Jung characterized them beautifully, I think, calling them the natural champion of all minorities with a future.
That paints a picture. It sounds like a venture capitalist or maybe a tech founder or a social activist.
Exactly. They're often entrepreneurs, political agitators, cultural revolutionaries. They have this uncanny knack for seeing the latent potential in a new market, a nascent technology, a budding social movement. They thrive on exploration, on discovery, on the new.
But what's the downside? There's always a downside.
Their great weakness, according to Jung, is their relentless pursuit of the next new thing. They are prone to abandoning ventures, relationships, even their own brilliant ideas, the moment things become stable or, dare I say, commonplace. They're constantly chasing the newest potential, often completely oblivious to their own need for rest, consolidation, or follow-through.
So always running towards the next horizon, maybe leaving a trail of half-finished projects or neglected relationships behind them.
That's the potential shadow side, yes.
Okay, and what about the introverted intuitive type? How are they different?
These types are oriented almost entirely by internal images bubbling up from the unconscious. Often, these are the deep, universal images Jung called archetypes. They're plumbing the depths of the inner psychic world, seeking to perceive the underlying meaning behind events, rather than focusing on the external events themselves.
So who fits this type?
Jung placed the mystics, the prophets, the religious founders in this category, but also, potentially, the cranks, if their visions become too detached from shared reality.
A prophet or a crank, that's quite a range.
Yeah.
But it really speaks to the power and maybe the danger of those intense internal visions.
It absolutely does. Their visions can be profoundly transformative, potentially world-changing. But their primary struggle, their core challenge, is this critical internal tension. They feel this intense need to protect their unique internal visions from being corrupted or misunderstood by the external world,
Right.
while simultaneously needing to find some way to make those very private ideas comprehensible, persuasive, and maybe even useful to other people. It's a huge balancing act.
And if they fail to bridge that gap?
Then their profound internal world remains isolated, maybe seen as merely eccentric and potentially useless to society at large. It stays locked inside. And, the Myers-Briggs indicator later tried to codify this Jungian distinction, recognizing the deep differences between the intuitive, whose energy flows outward towards change like ENFPs or ENTPs, versus the intuitive, whose energy flows inward towards meaning INFJs or INTJs.
Wow. Okay, so we've gone from intuition as a potentially flawed cognitive shortcut in modern psychology to it being a central pillar of personality, according to Jung. Now let's pivot completely. Let's move geographically and philosophically to Eastern thought, because here intuition often isn't seen as just a cognitive function at all, but as a direct pathway to ultimate realization.
Exactly.
Here intuition seems fundamentally intertwined with religion and spirituality.
Yeah, this is a really necessary contextual shift we have to make. In much of Eastern philosophy, intuition isn't about, optimizing a quarterly business report or figuring out where a fire is located. It's often presented as a core epistemological tool, a way of knowing, for realizing the ultimate interconnected truth of existence.
Okay, let's start with Hinduism. Sri Aurobindo, for instance, his interpretation places intuition under this realm of what he calls knowledge by identity. What does that mean?
Right. Aurobindo was really focused on the evolution of consciousness. He described the human psychological plane using the Sanskrit term mana. And mana for him essentially has two functions. One is the everyday job, interpreting the external world using basic sensory data and reason.
Okay, standard stuff.
Standard stuff. But the other higher function of mana is generating consciousness itself. And that's where knowledge by identity comes in.
And intuition lives in that higher function. So what does he mean by identity? Knowing by identity.
Intuitive knowledge, in this view, is about knowing something by, quite literally, being one with it. It's a difference between, say, studying a detailed map of a mountain range and actually standing on the summit, experiencing the wind, the view, the feeling of being there.
Yeah.
The intuitive knowledge is that direct experience. It offers a direct link between the self and the other, or the outer self, completely bypassing the need for sensory inference or logical deduction.
That's a profound difference. And he believed this kind of intuitive knowledge was actually more common in ancient Vedic humans before reason sort of took over. That sounds almost like a step backward, like a decline.
It might seem like a decline from our modern perspective, yeah. But Aurobindo reframed it quite cleverly as a constructive, necessary process. He called it the circle of progress.
Okay.
He argued that reason had to take the reins for a period in human evolution. Its job was to analyze, categorize, organize the world, basically, build the structures of science and logic. But reason, for Aurobindo, is a necessary but ultimately lower faculty. Yeah, a lower faculty that is currently being pushed to its limits, forced to evolve, forced to try and incorporate as much as possible from the higher intuitive way of working. So reason isn't the final destination. It's more like a transitional phase. It forces this rigorous organization of thought before humanity can fully and consciously reintegrate intuition, but at a higher, more conscious level of evolution than before.
Huh. So the entire scientific revolution could be seen as like spiritual growing pains in that view, preparing us for a higher form of knowing.
In that framework, yes, something like that. And this idea of consciousness existing in a kind of hierarchy, it's echoed by other Eastern thinkers too. Osho, for example, he saw consciousness moving upward from basic animal instincts at the bottom,
Right.
rising to intelligence, which is the analytic reasoning stage, and then ultimately rising to intuition, which he considered the highest human state. For Osho, living permanently in that state of fluid, immediate intuitive knowing was one of humanity's ultimate aims.
And we also see this in the Advaita Vedanta school, right? They take it to the extreme of non-dualism, viewing intuition as the specific experience that allows a practitioner to directly contact and experience Brahman, the ultimate reality, the unity underlying everything.
That unity perspective is absolutely foundational in much of Eastern thought. And if we move specifically to Buddhism, intuition is again viewed as a faculty of immediate knowledge. But importantly, it resides beyond conscious thinking. Not necessarily because it's mystical, but because the rational conscious mind is seen as inherently limited. It simply cannot always access or communicate the vast amounts of subconscious or even universal information it might hold.
Okay.
Intuition, in this Buddhist view, is the faculty that can bypass the limitations of language, of linear thought, of the discriminating mind.
So if the conscious mind is limited, how do you actually develop this faculty that bypasses it? Do they have techniques?
Oh, yes. This is where Zen Buddhism offers some really practical, albeit unusual techniques. They famously use koans.
Ah, the riddles. Like, what is the sound of one hand clapping?
Exactly those. Koans are specifically designed to be utterly unsolvable by rational, logical thought. Your intellect just hits a brick wall.
Okay, so what's the point?
The student is instructed to meditate on the koan, focus intensely on it, until the rational mind essentially collapses from the sheer impossibility of finding a logical answer.
It just gives up.
It's forced to give up. And that collapse, that breakdown of the logical faculty, is meant to force the mind to make an intuitive leap. It can lead to a sudden flash of insight, a non-logical understanding known as minor enlightenment or satori.
Wow.
The technique deliberately forces a separation between the individual, discriminating mind, the part that analyzes and judges, and what Zen calls the universal mind, or no mind. Intuition in this context acts as the bridge. It's the mental state that exists between that absolute undifferentiated truth and our everyday personal perception.
It's like the ultimate cognitive hack. You intentionally break the logic machine to force a deeper, non-logical insight.
Okay, so we've seen intuition as this revolutionary internal guide in the East. Now let's swing back to the West, back to philosophy, which is, fundamentally rooted in logic and reason. And Western philosophy has struggled for millennia, it seems, to figure out where intuition fits, without just dismissing it entirely as mere superstition.
It's a constant tension, absolutely. Yeah. And we really have to start where Western philosophy more or less begins, with Plato. His early definitions framed intuition not as some kind of mental trick, but as a fundamental human capacity to comprehend the deepest, truest nature of reality itself.
And this is where he introduces that really powerful concept of anamnesis, isn't it? The idea of remembering.
Yes, exactly. In dialogues like the Meno and the Phaedo, Plato argues that knowledge isn't truly learned in the way we usually think about it. It's actually recollected. Anamnesis is this idea that we possess pre-existing knowledge, residing in our immortal soul of eternity, knowledge our soul possessed before we were even born.
And we access this innate, perfect truth intuitively.
So if I suddenly understand a complex geometric proof, like in a flash, Plato would say, I didn't just learn that mathematical truth in that moment, I actually remembered it from my soul's pre-existence.
That is precisely the argument. He argued that things like mathematical truths or the perfect injuries forms the ideal concepts of beauty, justice, goodness. They are eternal and unchanging. And since we can conceive of them as perfect and eternal, we must be accessing them intuitively through recollection, rather than deriving them step by step from our imperfect, constantly changing sensory experiences of the world.
Right, because nothing in the physical world is perfectly beautiful or perfectly just.
Exactly. So intuition, for Plato, isn't a feeling. It's a direct intellectual glimpse of objective, eternal reality mediated by the soul.
Okay, now let's fast forward quite a few centuries. We see this kind of Platonic idea, intuition, as accessing a higher truth, getting adapted and maybe spiritualized within Islamic philosophy.
That synthesis is really fascinating. Intuition in Islamic philosophy is often called hadas. It's a great word. Translates poetically as something like hitting correctly on a mark, like an arrow finding its target instantly.
Right.
And in its highest form, hadas was often related to prophethood, the prophet's ability to have immediate, correct comprehension of divine will or truth without needing intermediaries.
And figures like Sihab al-Din al-Suhrawardi, building on Neoplatonism, they argued that this intuitive knowledge comes through illumination, like a light switching on.
Exactly. Suhrawardi saw intuition as knowledge acquired through illumination, meaning it was fundamentally mystical in nature, not something earned simply through rational study. He suggested that for a person to attain correct intuitive judgment, they needed to engage in mystical contemplation, mushahada. It's like a purification process, polishing the mirror of the soul so it can reflect the divine light and receive knowledge directly.
And Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, another giant, he also championed this intuitive capacity, right?
Yes, Avicenna described intuition as a kind of prophetic capacity, available to some degree even to nonprofits. Crucially, he contrasted this intuitive knowledge which he saw as obtained without intentional acquisition, spontaneously with regular knowledge, which he viewed as often being based on imitation or just rote learning. For Avicenna, intuition was a higher, faster, more certain form of intellectual grasp, a superior way of knowing necessary truths.
Okay, now we jump forward again into the early modern era in Europe with René Descartes. He famously tried to redefine intuition, but within the strict, almost mechanical confines of rationalism. He wanted to strip away the mystical aspects, right?
Absolutely. Descartes, also drawing on that Latin root intuor, to see, defined intuition very specifically. For him, it was pre-existing knowledge, yes, but knowledge gained through rational reasoning or intense mental contemplation. He wasn't talking about a vague feeling at all. He was talking about a specific act of the mind that yields immediate, undeniable clarity. This is what philosophers call rational intuition.
And he had that famous rule that defined it, didn't he?
The famous rule, yes. Whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive to be true is true. For Descartes, an intuition was that mental act by which a self-evident truth like the fact that a triangle must have 3 sides or that thinking requires existence is grasped immediately, completely, and without any possibility of doubt. It's the sheer clarity of reason recognizing itself. His famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, is the ultimate example of what he considered a foundational, self-evident, rational intuition.
So he essentially took that Platonic idea of immediate, certain knowledge, but he grounded it firmly in the human rational intellect, not in some eternal soul or divine illumination.
Exactly. He secularized it, in a way. And he considered intuition and deduction the only possible sources of reliable knowledge. Deduction, for Descartes, was really just a connected sequence of intuitions, just carefully chaining together those undeniable, clear, and distinct ideas grasped by intuition.
Okay, that Cartesian certainty starts to maybe crack a little bit with the empiricists like David Hume. Hume's take on intuition seems much more ambiguous, kind of fitting uncomfortably within his whole philosophy that all knowledge comes from sense experience.
Right. Hume had a bit of a problem here. As a strict empiricist, believing all knowledge derives from sensory experience, he struggled to categorize how we recognize basic relationships, things like time, place, resemblance, cause, and effect. At first, he said the recognition of these simple relations would strike the eye, clearly suggesting sensory input.
Okay.
But then he immediately corrected himself, adding, or rather, in mind. And that little correction, or rather in mind, is key. By attributing the ability to recognize these connections to the power of the mind itself, rather than just the raw sensory data coming in, he implicitly introduced a non-empirical element. His system couldn't fully account for that immediate mental leap that organizes experience, even though he couldn't deny it happens. It muddied his pure empiricism a bit.
And then Maybe the most profound shift, the most complex view, comes with Immanuel Kant. Kant's definition seems to throw out Plato's eternal soul and Descartes' purely rational clarity.
Oh, Kant's notion of intuition is dramatically different from pretty much all his predecessors. It's really revolutionary. For Kant, intuition isn't some high-level insight. It's the most basic, fundamental sensory information provided by our cognitive faculty of sensibility. It's essentially raw perception.
Raw perception, that sounds incredibly mundane compared to Plato or Avicenna. Just like seeing a table in front of me is intuition for Kant.
Yes, but, and this is the crucial Kantian twist with a massive caveat, Kant argued that our mind is not a blank slate passively receiving data. Instead, it has innate built-in organizing structures. Our mind automatically casts all of our external intuitions, everything we perceive in the world outside us, into the form of space.
Okay.
And similarly, it casts all of our internal intuitions, our thoughts, memories, the sequence of our own consciousness, into the pure form of time.
So intuition isn't the meaning of the table or the abstract idea of tableness, but just the raw sensory data of the table. And my mind automatically organizes that data by placing it over there in a spatial relationship with everything else, and now in a temporal relationship with my other thoughts.
Precisely. For Kant, if we didn't have this inherent pre-programmed capacity to structure reality using space and time, the raw sensory data, the intuitions, would just be a meaningless, chaotic buzz, a blooming, buzzing confusion, as William James later put it.
Oh.
Intuition, the raw data, is only made intelligible because it gets filtered through these innate structures of space and time. This is why Kant famously argued that space and time are not objective properties of the world itself, but necessary properties of our minds, the way we are built to perceive. His philosophy placed intuition firmly back into the process of perception, but as the raw material, not the finished product, and definitely not in the realm of the eternal soul or pure disembodied reason.
Okay, finally, let's bring this up to the present day. Philosophers today still appeal to intuition constantly, right? They say things like, well, it intuitively seems that X is morally wrong, or intuitively this thought experiment shows Y. But this practice has drawn some serious fire recently, especially from experimental philosophers.
Just the X-Fi movement, experimental philosophy, is essentially asking, okay, you say it's intuitive, but where's the data? They argue that philosophical claims based on appeals to intuition must be tested empirically, often using methods from social science, like surveys.
Why? What's the problem they see?
The critical problem they highlight is that people's reported intuitions differ dramatically. They vary based on culture, language, socioeconomic status, even gender sometimes.
So if my intuition about, say, moral responsibility in a specific scenario is fundamentally different from your intuition, maybe because of our different cultural backgrounds, then how can either of our intuitions serve as reliable, objective evidence for some universal philosophical claim about responsibility?
That is the absolute core of the challenge they pose. It really shakes the foundations of traditional armchair philosophy. The responses have been varied and quite nuanced. Some philosophers, like Timothy Williamson, argue that intuition plays no special role in philosophy anyway. It's just a form of general judgment. So skepticism about intuition is just general skepticism about judgment overall. If you doubt intuition, you have to doubt all judgment, which seems too radical.
Okay.
Others, like Ernest Sosa, argue that many of these objections actually highlight a merely verbal disagreement about what the word intuition refers to, rather than revealing a fundamental flaw in our basic cognitive capacity to make immediate, non-inferential judgment.
And we absolutely have to mention the really radical legacy of Kant's ideas about intuition in mathematics. Mathematical intuitionism.
Ah, yes, Brouwer and Haiting. This gets complex fast, but it's a necessary piece of the puzzle. Mathematical intuitionism, championed primarily by L.E.J. Brouwer and later formalized by Aaron Haiting, it rejects some fundamental rules of classical logic that mathematicians have used for centuries. Specifically, they reject the law of the excluded middle.
The law of excluded middle, that's the basic idea that any statement is either true or false, right? There's no third option. How can you reject that?
It's a massive rejection. Their reasoning derived directly from Kant's idea that mathematical knowledge comes from pure forms of intuition, specifically the intuition of time or sequence. Intuitionists believe that mathematical objects like numbers or sets only truly exist if they can be constructively proven or mentally built by the human mind through a finite sequence of steps. Because of this focus on mental construction, they reject proofs by contradiction, known as reductio ad absurdum. Just showing that the non-existence of something leads to a logical contradiction does not, for an intuitionist, constructively prove that the thing actually exists in the intuitively accessible world of mathematics. Mathematical knowledge, they argue, must originate in the constructive, intuitive activity of the human mind, not just in abstract logical manipulations that might refer to infinite or non-constructible entities. It's a radically different view of what mathematics fundamentally is.
Okay, wow. Shifting gears dramatically now, away from mathematical proofs and pure forms of intuition, let's bring this whole concept right back down to earth. Let's put it into the tough, pragmatic world of high finance corporate strategy, basically the boardroom.
Right.
Because in this environment, intuition seems to be constantly fighting for legitimacy. It's always up against the demand for hard data, metrics, quantitative analysis.
It's the ultimate push and pull in business, isn't it? Intuition gets frequently dismissed as, too soft, too mystical, unreliable, basically the opposite of rigorous scientific management. And yet, executives who operate in really complex, high uncertainty environments often say they find it absolutely indispensable.
Yeah, I remember seeing a Harvard Business Review article from, I think, 2022. It noted that surveys show a really significant majority of top executives actually do leverage their feelings and their past experience, essentially, their intuition, when they're handling major crises or making big, non-routine decisions.
Exactly. And that suggests that when the data is incomplete, maybe contradictory or just plain overwhelming,
Oh.
or when time is the absolute critical factor, the executive's internal pattern recognition system, their intuition, kind of has to take over.
Right.
There was also an interesting Australian study of elite business leaders. They found that these leaders considered intuition, which they defined specifically as a gut feeling based on deep experience, to be crucial for their overall effectiveness as leaders.
And they tended to apply it most in areas where objective metrics traditionally struggle, right? Like judging people.
Precisely. They found it particularly important for judgments about people hiring decisions, assessing team dynamics, figuring out who to trust. Also for reading the culture, getting a feel for the underlying health or toxicity of an organization. And crucially, for long-term strategy sensing shifts in the market or competitive landscape before the hard data confirms them.
Mm.
These are all areas that require massive, fast pattern recognition based on subtle cues, the kind of thing that a purely System 2 analytical approach would take weeks or months to process, if it could even capture the right variables at all.
So in business, intuition acts almost like an early warning system, or maybe a high-speed prediction engine for navigating ambiguity and complexity.
That's a great way to put it. Business intuition is often likened to that kind of preconscious activity Klein talked about. It's the recognition of subtle danger signals, maybe a slight tone shift in a negotiation, a hesitation in a supplier's voice, a weird vibe in the market data, and the initiation of protective or opportunistic responses before your conscious awareness can fully articulate the precise threat or opportunity.
But, and this is a big but, we absolutely have to provide the counterbalance here. Because the warnings against just blindly trusting your gut in business are just as loud, maybe even louder sometimes.
Oh, absolutely critical. Yes, that earlier HBR article, the one titled something like "Don't Trust Your Gut," that's mandatory reading too. The core message there is stark. Relying on intuition when you don't have an adequate, relevant experience base.
Right.
Or, maybe words, using intuition as a deliberate substitute for rational analysis when analysis is possible and necessary. That's just indulging in a risky delusion, as they put it.
Can you give a classic example of that risky delusion in action in a business context?
It often happens in big deals, like mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah.
You might have an executive who, relying purely on a powerful gut feeling they got from a single meeting, maybe they just clicked with the CEO of the target company.
Yeah, the chemistry factor.
Exactly, the chemistry factor. They might push through a massive merger based on that feeling, bypassing or downplaying critical due diligence about, say, hidden financial liabilities or fundamental culture clashes that the data team is flagging. That emotional confidence or that superficial pattern matched the System 1 confidence overrides the necessary System 2 checks and balances. And that can be catastrophic.
So the synthesis here seems pretty clear then. Business intuition isn't magic. It has to be built on a deep, relevant experience by the thousands of hours spent running deals, reading financial reports, managing people, whatever the domain is.
Right.
If you have that deep experience, then your intuition can act as that fast, valuable pattern-matching launch pad we talked about. But if you don't have the experience in that specific area, then your gut feeling is probably just ego or maybe wishful thinking masquerading as insight.
Perfectly put. We really circle right back to Klein's RPD model, don't we? Even here in these high-stakes business decisions. The fast pattern recognition, built on experience, initiates a potential response. And then conscious reason, system 2, needs to rush in to justify, refine, or crucially, sometimes veto that initial instantaneous feeling. The truly best decision makers, it seems, have a good sense of when their intuition is likely reliable and when it absolutely needs to be followed by rigorous proof and analysis. Hashtag outro boy.
Wow. We have covered so much ground today, haven't we? I mean, from Daniel Kahneman's fast, efficient, that often fallible System 1, the source of that instant confidence, all the way to Carl Jung's revolutionary personality types, the extroverted entrepreneurs and the introverted mystics defined by where they direct their intuitive energy.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. And we trace that philosophical lineage, too. Seeing intuition defined first as that ancient idea of pre-existing knowledge in the soul, Plato's anamnesis, and then getting radically redefined by Kant, not as high knowledge, but as the basic sensory perception that our mind filters through its innate structures of space and time. Such different conceptions.
Absolutely. And ultimately, whether you're a fighter pilot making a split-second tactical decision, or a CEO trying to judge corporate culture, or even a mathematician grasping a proof, our deep dive today suggests that intuition is maybe less about magic and much more about highly efficient, often unconscious pattern recognition.
Exactly.
And that recognition seems built almost entirely on a foundation of deep experience and domain-specific knowledge.
Yeah, the modern science really seems to support the ancient wisdom in a way. The ability to hit correctly on a mark, as those Islamist philosophers described, hadas. It seems to come directly from filling your internal archive with enough relevant data points, enough experiences, that you can recognize the crucial pattern almost instantaneously when it appears. Your intuitive speed and accuracy appear directly correlated to your prior investment in learning and experience.
As a final thought for you listening, let's remember that intuition, despite all the debates, is actually so respected in some circles that it's even been given a physical marker on our planet. There's actually a mountain peak down in Antarctica called Intuition Peak.
Is there really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it was named specifically, quote, in appreciation of the role of scientific intuition for the advancement of human knowledge.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, if some of the most profound leaps in human knowledge, whether they're scientific breakthroughs, philosophical insights, or mathematical discoveries, have historically been attributed, at least in part, to that single, often undeniable flash of intuitive insight, maybe the core question for you, listening right now, remains this. How much of what you confidently call your conscious, deliberate logic or reasoning is actually just incredibly rapid, well-justified intuition? Intuition that you simply learn to trust because you've tested it against experience thousands of times.
That's a provocative question.
And perhaps more practically, given the power of things like the RPD model, how do you intentionally structure your own learning and your own experiences today so that your gut, your intuition, has a better chance of getting it right more often tomorrow?